Warren Buffett said that he would rather wrestle grizzly bears than compete with this woman. Rose Blumkin, aka Mrs. B, was born Rosa Gorlick on December 3, 1893 in present-day Belarus. She was one of 8 children and her father was a rabbi and her mother ran a grocery store. The family of 10 struggled and slept in a 2-room log cabin on straw mattresses. At the age of 6, Mrs. B started working in her mother's grocery store. At the age of 13, she talked her way into a job as a store clerk. By 16, she was a manager with 6 men working under her. At the age of 20, she married Isidore Blumkin, who fled shortly after their wedding to the United States in order to avoid being drafted by the Russian army. 3 years later, Mrs. B followed him to the United States in 1917. Upon arrival in America, she didn't know any English, and the couple lived in Iowa for 2 years before moving to Omaha, Nebraska. In Omaha, they opened a second-hand clothing store, but when the Depression struck and with 4 children to take care of, they had to get creative. Mrs. B encouraged her husband to cut prices, branch into new products, and come up with innovative advertising. In her mid-40s in 1937, she decided to open a used furniture store in the basement of her husband's store with $500 that she borrowed from her brother. It was hard at first, and at one point the Blumkins had to sell off furniture from their own home in order to pay off a debt. But Mrs. B was able to set her store apart by selling products cheaper than any store around. Afraid of the competition, bigger stores were able to successfully get the furniture suppliers to stop selling to Mrs. B. But instead of giving up, she traveled around the country and bought from department stores and still undersold her rivals. Eventually, she was able to grow her business to become the largest indoor furniture store in America. Customers would travel from far and wide just to shop at her store. Eventually, she caught the attention of Warren Buffett, who was a customer of hers and acquaintance of her children. In 1983, Buffett bought a 90% share of Nebraska Furniture Mart for $60 million on a handshake deal without even looking at her books. After he closed the deal, Buffett said about Mrs. B, quote, "Put her up against the top graduates of the top business schools or Fortune 500 CEOs, and assuming an even start with the same resources, she'd run rings around them." As her children and grandchildren became more involved in the business, she felt like she was being frozen out of decisions. In 1989, at the age of 95, Mrs. B bitterly retired, but after 3 short months, she was back to work. Set up a rival store across the street from the furniture mart called Mrs. B's Clearance and Factory Outlet. In just 2 years, it had become profitable and was Omaha's 3rd largest carpet outlet. Her family eventually settled their differences, and Warren Buffett bought her new store in 1992, which he merged with Furniture Mart. On the experience, Buffett said that he would never make the mistake of letting Mrs. B retire without signing a non-compete again. She stood just 4'10", but her business skills could not be matched. She was still involved in day-to-day operations and was zipping around the store in a golf cart until shortly before she died at the age of 104 in 1998. Her creed was to, quote, "Sell cheap, tell the truth, and don't cheat nobody." Such an amazing woman.